I have, ladies and gentlemen, a nuanced position. In brief, I hold that Islam in theory can be compatible with democracy, but at this time is in fact an anti-democratic force. Do Muslims suffer more than others from dictators, tyrants, unelected presidents, kings, emirs, and various other strongmen? Yes. As reported by a professor of the United States, Frederick Pryor of Swarthmore College, looking at a broad swath of Muslim states, internationally, and looking particularly at Muslim states, he found, quote, in all but the poorest countries, Islam is associated with fewer political rights. The greater the percentage of Muslims in the population, the lower are the political rights in the country, unquote. He adds that citizens of very poor nations often enjoy few rights to begin with, and so Islam does not have much room to create a downward impact. Also, he found that countries with an Arab culture have lower political rights than other Muslim nations. So it's a fact that Muslim majority countries are more autocratic and less democratic than other countries. Why? Why should that be? Is Islam the problem? Well, it is the common factor, obviously, of Muslim countries, and it is therefore reasonable to conclude that Islam itself is incompatible with democracy, but I would say the matter is more subtle. Today's Muslim predicament of autocracy reflects more historical circumstances than innate features of Islam. Put differently, Islam, like all pre-modern religions, is undemocratic in spirit. No less than the others, however, it has the potential to evolve in a democratic direction. It is undemocratic in spirit in the sense that democracy involves political participation, and this is alien to religious traditions. If anything, they emphasize God's sovereignty and implies a power for the priests and a disdain for what the masses think. Democratic evolution has been difficult for all religions. To take the most prominent case, that of the Christian religion, the battle to limit the Catholic Church's political role can be traced back to Marsilius of Padua, publishing the Defensor Paxis in 1324, where he argued for separation of church and state as well as for papal elections by Christian believers. It took another 6 centuries, till the early 20th century, for the church fully to reconcile itself to democracy. 6 centuries. Why should Islam's transition be any smoother or any easier? This means that fundamental and profound changes are needed in Islam for it to become democratic. And in particular, the Islamic law, or the Sharia, needs to be dealt with. The Sharia was developed in the 7th to 11th centuries, in other words, at a time when the idea of democracy was weak to non-existent, and the Sharia is deeply anti-democratic. It presumes autocratic rulers and submissive subjects. It emphasizes God's will over popular sovereignty and encourages violent jihad to expand Islam's borders. Further, in a very anti-democratic spirit, it privileges Muslims over non-Muslims, males over females, and free persons over slaves. If Islam is to become democratic, the Sharia must be excluded from public life. This means removing the Quran, the Hadith, the Sunnah as obstacles to the development of democracy. This was done in Turkey almost a century ago by Ataturk, who simply removed Islam from public influence. More subtly, some Islamic thinkers have tried to find a way to keep Islam, but not the Sharia. For example, an eminent Sudanese theologian by the name of Mahmud Muhammad Taha distinguished between the gentler, more cosmological Meccan verses of the Quran that Muhammad received before becoming a political leader, and the harsher, more legalistic verses of the Medina period that followed his ascent to power. Taha argued that the former, the Meccan verses, represent the eternal principles of Islam, whereas the latter, the Medinan verses, applied only to Medina under Muhammad's rule. With this, he eliminated the Sharia, as it's generally understood. He made it specific to the 7th century and said it doesn't apply today. He didn't get anywhere with it. He's not been successful. He was not successful. But nonetheless, the kernel of an idea is there, and there are many other ways of approaching the Quran and the Hadith to make them adaptable to modern circumstances. This will be a difficult process, but it is a possible process. It would be a mistake to see Islam as unchanging, to see Islam as what it has been in the past. Islam is what Muslims make of it. Or to use a metaphor of Hassan Hanafi, a professor of philosophy at the University of Cairo, he said the Quran, quote, is a supermarket where one takes what one wants and leaves what one doesn't want, unquote. Or in my words, Islam's problem is less its being anti-modern than that the process of modernization has hardly begun. Muslims can modernize the religion, but it requires major changes. Out must go waging of jihad to impose Muslim rule. Out goes second-class citizenship for women and non-Muslims. Out goes death sentences for blasphemy and apostasy. In must come individual freedoms, civil rights, political participation, popular sovereignty, equality before the law, and representative elections. Now, there are two great obstacles towards this change. The first is primarily Middle Eastern and affects less, for example, Indonesia and Malaysia, but as the Middle East is the core region of Islam and the most influential, it has importance for all Muslims. The social system that came out of the Middle East is fundamentally a tribal one. There's a complex pattern of tribal autonomy and tyrannical centralism that obstructs the development of constitutionalism, the rule of law, citizenship, gender equality, and the other prerequisites of democracy. Not until this archaic social system based on the family is dispatched in favor of an order that's based on the individual can democracy make real strides. Secondly, Islamism, radical Islam, totalitarian Islam, political Islam is a huge obstacle towards reaching democracy. This is the most powerful ideological movement in the world today, not just the Muslim world. It obstructs democracy in many ways because it seeks not to reform or marginalize the Sharia, but to reassert the Sharia in its full force, which is the opposite of what's needed. A jihadist like Osama bin Laden may spell out this goal much more clearly than an establishment politician like the Prime Minister of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, but both of them, coming to this issue from very different perspectives, seek to create a thoroughly anti-democratic, if not totalitarian order. The Islamists respond to democracy in two ways. First of all, they denounce it as un-Islamic. If one looks at the major figures of 20th century radical Islam, one will see that they are unanimous in this view. For example, the founder of the Muslim Brethren, Hassan al-Banna, said that democracy is a betrayal of Islamic values. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the imam who preaches on Al Jazeera television, argues that elections are heretical. But at the same time, the Islamists are eager to exploit the electoral process and have done very well throughout the Muslim world in gathering and gaining power through elections, particularly a terrorist organization, Hamas, won an election in the Palestinian Authority. This record does not render the Islamists democratic, but indicates that they are tactically flexible and they are determined to gain power. As Erdogan, the Prime Minister of Turkey, has put it, quote, democracy is like a streetcar. When you come to your stop, you get off, unquote. In conclusion, there's a contrast between theory and practice. Yes, Islam can become democratic through hard work, but in the meanwhile, radical Islam, this powerful ideological force, represents the world's leading anti-democratic movement. Thank you.